Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. Bluegrass Jam Along is also brought to you by Token Picks, individually machined guitar and mandolin picks to bring out the best in you and your instrument.
I heard through the grapevine that he was trying to get a hold of me, and they gave me his number, so I called him, and we went and met, and he said, yeah, I'm putting this band together, and gave me a copy of Acoustics, and I think he played the test pressing of Mar West, and it was like super exciting music, and he had a few charts, and he said, why don't you see if you can learn some of these and come back and we'll get together. Which I did to the best of my abilities, and went back and had learned Old Greycoat and a bit of Gasology. And he was very, very enthusiastic. I remember this. He said, okay, well, I'm not looking for another mandolin player anymore, which was, incredibly exciting to hear.
Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jam Along. My guest on the podcast this week is John Reischman, mandolin player, and we had a chat about his new record, the Salish Sea, which I really like, which is John Reischman and the Jaybirds. And they've been together for years, and we have a really interesting conversation about that record, about kind of them as a band, how they work, how they came together. Really cool stuff. And we also chat about the title track, because it's part of a longer concerto piece that John wrote for a Freshgrass Commission, and that's also been recorded as a separate thing, so it was really interesting talking about that as well. Chat about things like the use of twin mandolins, which was inspired by that first Grisman Rounder album, and what influence that was on John. And also kind of with that Grisman connection, John went on to play with the Tony Rice unit in the early 80s in his Tony's sort of post-Grisman phase, and we talk about that as well. John was really keen to chat about that because he sort of thinks it's an under-discussed bit of Tony's career, which I would definitely agree with. There's sort of 3 records that came out around then that Johnny was part of 2 of. There was Mar West, but then Still Inside and Backwaters, both of which John is on. And that instrumental phase of Tony's career, those kind of jazz-inspired, quite, lots of space in those records, lots of improvisation. They're really cool, and they're maybe not talked about as much. And maybe that's partly because until recently, Backwaters wasn't available, and that's come out again thanks to a reissue from Kraft Recordings. But also Mar West and Still Inside never made it to CD. They're sort of compiled into Devlin, but they never made it on to CD as records in their own right. They're not on the streaming services. So it was really interesting to dig into that bit as well, and sort of John's time with Tony, how he met him, how that all sort of kicked off. So yeah, really interesting conversation. It was really great to talk to John. All the usual stuff applies. If you have enjoyed this episode, or by the time you get to the end of it, if you've enjoyed it, because you wouldn't know yet, would you? Please do share it with somebody else who you think might like it. Recommendations are a really important part of the growth of this podcast, and so please do send an episode to somebody if you think they might like it. BluegrassJamAlong.com for info, lists of all the interviews, lists of all the fiddle tunes, all the chord sheets, everything you might possibly want. But here comes my chat with John Reischman. John, welcome to Bluegrass Jam Along. It's great to meet you.
Yeah, likewise, Matt. I'm happy to be here.
And you have a recent album that we're going to chat about called The Salish Sea, which I've been listening to and really enjoying. And the first to me obvious question is, what is the Salish Sea?
Okay, well, it's the body of water between the North American mainland and Vancouver Island. So it used to be known as the Strait of Georgia, but it's been changed to the name of the First Nations people, Salish folks who lived there originally.
Excellent. That is brilliant. And it's really interesting because it's billed as John Reischman and the Jaybirds, but it very much feels like a group record in terms of kind of the voices, the writing, the kind of general vibe of it.
Yeah, that was intentional when I started the band 27 years ago, that, I basically wanted to be in a band. So I decided to start one, and I never conceived it of it as being me and a backup band. I like the collaboration and I like having two lead singers and, everyone contributing. So yes, you're right.
That band's been kind of together pretty much in the same formation for a long time now.
Yeah. Well, we've just had one significant personnel change about almost 10 years ago when Jim Nunley, who was a guitarist for a long time, old friend of mine, he left, and Patrick Sauber is someone I'd known for a good long while, and I just thought he would join the band as a sub, fill in the dates we had on the calendar, and I'd, sort out who we would hire. But he was such a great fit. I just had to ask him, if he was willing to take on another band, because he was in at least 4 significant other groups at the time. And I thought, he's so good, it's worth dealing with having to get subs on occasion. So he said yes, and he's still in the group.
And how does that work? Are you kind of pretty geographically spread out?
Yeah, we, the 4 of the 5 of us have been together for 27 years, so we kind of know how each other, what to expect from each other musically, and everyone's conscientious about having their end of things together. So typically we just meet up in the town where we're starting the tour, and if there's time, we'll run the sets, and if there's not, we won't, and we'll just hit the stage. And it almost always feels really good.
And what's your process with a record like this? Because it's been a while since the last one, hasn't it? How do you sort of find your material?
Well, let's see now. Well, individuals have contributed, like Nick Hornbuckle has written a lot of great tunes over the years, and he contributed a pretty traditional sounding one for him. He's a lot of his writing, has been, I wouldn't say it's progressive, but it's different than a typical bluegrass banjo player might come up with. Chord progressions and melodies, he's a very melodic player. And he's got this unique style on the banjo where he plays with just 2 fingers. Originally he played with 3, but somehow it worked itself out for him to just proceed with the most success with 2 fingers. And because of that, he has a distinctive style. So I knew he would contribute. And Greg Spatz has written a few tunes, our fiddler, and he came up with this great one called the Reunion. And Trisha Gagnon, our bass player, is quite a prolific songwriter. So she had a couple on the go. And then with Patrick, he doesn't write, but we'd take drives and he'd suggest tunes. And I think that opening track, the Banks of Jordan, we were both listening to the Cook duet, which is this. Apparently, I'm not sure their first names, but the husband in the duet is Jack Cook's brother from the long years with the Stanley Brothers and other folks. So, and he and his wife have, not Jack, but his brother, had this gospel duet, which was just, killer vocals, great material. And that's where we landed on Banks of Jordan.
Yeah, and there's some great stuff on this record, and particularly the title track, I love. And it's from a kind of longer piece, isn't it?
Yes.
I understand it came out of a Freshgrass Commission.
That's right. Yeah, I was asked to write this, what they call a Bluegrass Concerto in 2024, which I was very excited about, very pleased that they would ask me to do that. So I started working on it. And at the time, I didn't have much to contribute to the new Jaybirds recording. So I thought that first tune, which was the Salish Sea, that first movement, would be a good one to include, even if I was going to re-record it at a later date, because I was excited about the tune. And yeah. And then I think that was the only part of the concerto that was up and running when we wrapped up the record and subsequently finished the second movement, which is a waltz, and the final movement, which is more of an up-tempo bluegrass tune with a kind of breaks down into more a new acoustic approach, long improvisation.
And I've talked to a few people who've done the Freshgrass Commissions, both from the song cycle side and the concerto side. And it's interesting how people approach it. Did you sort of treat it as one piece in 3 movements, or is it more sort of 3 distinct but connected tunes for you?
I'd say there's distinct but related, at least key-wise, and somewhat thematically. too. Like the first one is in E minor. Actually, I'd played around with different keys. Like initially I thought it would be G minor and was working on it for a long time and then realized this is going to make more sense if it's an E minor, the way the melody laid out. And then that led to the second movement, which is a slow waltz, also in E minor. And I should say, as soon as they asked me, I was very excited and thought, oh, I can do this, or I had concepts of what I would want to include. And that first movement, I kind of conceived it initially as more of a old time sounding thing. And that's the first little melodic phrase has this kind of frailing, where I mimic a frailing banjo, which locks into this pattern that Nick has done, and we've done that a lot over the years. And but then it changed into more of a new acoustic sounding piece. And then the way they kind of sent out a synopsis of what they thought it should include, and they said, oh, it could be 3 fiddle tunes and a waltz, or it could be this or that. And I just thought, well, I love those bluegrass waltzes like Lonesome Moonlight Waltz. And actually, I just got refamiliarized with this great Norman Blake composition called the 9 Years Waltz, which was on album by a band called Red, White, and Bluegrass that I had way early on, 50 years ago. And I just found a link to it, and it's a beautiful tune. So that's another type of, or example of those sort of lonesome waltzes, as I call them. And then for the third movement, I had this idea or inspiration from David Grisman's first rounder record, where it's basically bluegrass, but on these major happy sounding tunes like Boston Boy and Song on the Strings, he has twin mandolins, which I really love that sound. So I wanted to kind of incorporate that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think a lot of people associate Grisman with minor key tunes and, that, but there's just that record, but just sort of peppered throughout. There's a lot of major key stuff and things like Dog's Bull on Hot Dog with the twin mandolins.
Yeah. I love those tunes. I mean, I love all the stuff he's written, but that's something about, and I guess the tunes on that rounder record that are in a major key that he uses the 2 mandolins maybe are traditional, or, traditional, I'd say, like Boston Boy and Song on the Strings. I think that comes maybe from Reno and Smiley. I'm not sure.
We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com. Founded in Petaluma, California, and born of a love for music, Token has developed a unique approach to making picks. Individually machined from premium materials like Ultem, Peak, and compression moulded Taulon, Token picks are designed to bring clarity, speed, and tone to your playing. Used by top artists like Chris Eldridge, Jake Workman, Andy Falco, and Trey Hensley, Token picks are fast becoming a bluegrass favourite. Follow on Instagram at TokenMade and learn more at tokenmade.com. Yeah, and so I saw that you had planned, I think maybe you already have now, recorded the full concerto.
Yeah, just a couple of weeks ago, we the band went to North Adams to the Freshgrass site, and they have a studio there, and they invited me to come back and record the piece. They've been very supportive and enthusiastic about the whole project. And the original performance in 2024, I knew Daryl Anger was going to be there, and I love the twin fiddles, so I invited him to be part of it, which he's happy to say he was very excited about. And also my friend Sharon Gilchrist, who we've played a fair bit of music over the years, I invited her to come and play the second mandolin part. And we performed it there and had a good response from the audience. So and since then, we've been performing it in the Jaybirds just as a 5-piece, and it still goes over really good. So it seemed like timely to get it recorded.
And when you're writing something like that, particularly with like a very established band, are you thinking of those? Because you mentioned a particularly kind of individualistic banjo style, and are you writing for those kind of voices as you do it?
I think so. I think I had the band, the Jaybirds, in mind. I mean, specifically Nick, because we've done this, kind of duet, conversational thing with this technique that I've used on various tunes, like Salt Spring for one, and many others, which is, I just call it kind of a fake frailing pattern. And then the way he's developed this thing on the banjo, it has this old time quality too. So I knew I did want to include that. And beyond that, I just thought twin fiddles, I love that. And I also like the idea of twin mandolins. And I don't know, maybe, subconsciously, the first concerto I was ever aware of was Vivaldi's 2-mandolin concerto. So that might have had something to do with it.
And what are your plans for that? Because, some people like Jerry Douglas and Jacob Jolliffe have put their concertos as kind of centerpieces of a record. Sierra Hull's just released hers as a standalone thing, kind of on the streaming service. Is it going to be on a kind of new album at some point?
Yeah, it'll be on a part of a new solo record for me. So I had one other session with different tunes, but both this new session, all the tunes they didn't exist before the session. Like there was a couple musicians I knew I wanted to record with, and one is Sammy Brayman, who from the Onlys. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's a fantastic old time fiddler, and she's originally from Seattle, which is not that far away from where I live in Vancouver. And I thought, well, maybe she's going to be home for Christmas, so I'll see if I can book the studio and get her and some other folks, including Alison DeGroot and Eli West and a bass player named Sam Howard. So booked the studio, got the band lined up, but I didn't have any tunes, so I had to write some stuff, which I would prefer to do than just cover some traditional things, which, I like that too. But I knew that Sammy was a fan of tunes in F, and so I came up with this new tune in the key of F, and then some others too. So it was interesting.
And so how long in advance of recording did you get the tunes together then? Was it literally the last minute?
Of this, it was a few weeks. I also should mention Patrick McGonigal, the fiddle player who used to be in the Lonely Hearts String Band. He co-produced the session, and so I'd get together with him a little bit and say, "What do you think?" And he had some good input, and so I think it was maybe a 3-week lead time. I had the tunes, and actually was able to perform at least one of them at a small festival. So and the way we recorded that was just no headphones, just in a circle with the mics open, and not worrying about overdubbing or fixing things so much, which was really fun. It was really satisfying to record music, which I'd never done quite like that before.
Well, it allows for a kind of, use the word conversational before, and it definitely allows for that kind of, that feel.
Yeah, it was really satisfying, and they're, primarily there's pretty straight old time type melodies, with my own little melodic quirks in there, but yeah, it was not the kind of thing like on this concerto recording where we're taking solos where you want to get the best possible solo possible, and so we might overdub and fix things or edit 2 takes together, that kind of thing. But none of that really happened on this earlier old time session.
And with the concerto, like, to what extent was it composed versus kind of leaving room for improvisation? Because some people go all the way down the route of it's almost pretty much a composed thing, and some people leave a lot of space.
No, it was like the main melody, was composed, and then people were free to solo however they saw fit to, reference the melody or leave it completely behind. I think the waltz is the most straightforward, and that doesn't get too wild. It's pretty much the melody throughout, or harmonized melody.
Yeah, sometimes with a really simple melody, it's harder to stray from the melody when you get a really clear melody, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
And it's interesting talking about sort of the instrumental side of things, because when we talked before doing this interview, one of the things you brought up that you'd be interested to talk about was some of the music that you made with the Tony Rice unit, particularly in the instrumental phase of what he was doing. And I'd love to know, just to start that conversation off, how you first met Tony, how that all came about.
Well, I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in '78 and joined a band called the Good Old Persons, which was really influential band in that area, and I was a fan of theirs prior to that, and so I got the call and moved to the Bay Area from where I was living in Oregon, and so I was part of the scene, and I had seen the Grisman Quintet several times before that, before I even moved to the Bay Area, and I was a huge fan. And I also saw the Great American Music Band, and I saw Olden and the Way, so I was very aware of David Grisman. And and Tony was just living in the Bay Area, and I think we lived both lived in Marin County. And every once in a while, he'd show up at the local bar where we played, Paul's Saloon, or even the local pizza parlor. So I met him that way, but I didn't ever play with him. But I guess when he and David sort of parted ways, he decided he was going to start his own band, the Tony Rice Unit, and he was looking for, I guess he always assumed and wanted Todd Phillips to play bass. And he needed a fiddle player and a mandolin player, and he had seen me play, so I think he was somewhat aware of what I could do. But so I went over and talked to him. He called up, and I heard through the grapevine that he was trying to get a hold of me, and they gave me his number, so I called him, and we went and met, and he said, "Yeah, I'm putting this band together," and gave me a copy of Acoustics, and I think he played the test pressing of Mar West. And it was like super exciting music. And he had a few charts, and he said, why don't you see if you can learn some of these and come back and we'll get together, which I did to the best of my abilities, and went back and had learned Old Gray Coat and a bit of Gasology. And he was very, very enthusiastic. I remember this. He said, "Okay, well, I'm not looking for another mandolin player anymore," which was, incredibly exciting to hear, because I was just young guy, 25, something like that.
It's a really interesting phase of his career, and maybe isn't talked about so much. And maybe it's because those two records in particular, Mar West and Still Inside, some of the tracks came out on Devlin as a compilation, but those two records have been out of print for some time and never made it onto CD, and maybe that's one of the reasons that it's a bit less known. But you think of Tony and you think of his singing and his playing, and you don't necessarily think of him as much as a writer, but that phase of kind of the instrumental stuff, he was writing a lot of tunes and creating in a different sort of way than we're used to thinking of Tony.
Yeah, he was really prolific. And I mean, there was, I think those are pretty much all original, except maybe he covered Nardis, the Miles Davis tune, or Bill Evans maybe is who really wrote it. But and then when I joined, we didn't perform for about a year because he was still looking for a fiddle player, but he was writing these tunes, and he'd give me a cassette of the melodies, and I'd go learn them and the chord progressions. But he came up with some beautiful melodies. I mean, not just the really fiery instrumentals like Gasology, but beautiful waltzes like Waltz for Indira. And so the one on Backwaters, just Some Bar in the French Quarters. I mean, that's great. And so I was very fortunate to be in that position. I was really in the right place at the right time.
And how you talk about learning those tunes from charts and things, and I'm really curious as to what those were like in a way, because as an outsider listening to it, and from some of the people I've talked to, it really feels like Tony was inventing a whole chord vocabulary that was his, rather than playing what a jazz guitarist would have traditionally played across certain changes. He just found some shapes and some ways of getting between harmonic shifts that were very much him.
Yeah. I'm not really a guitarist, although in the early days, he had the idea that on some of these waltzes, maybe I could play second guitar, sort of fill out the sound. So there are a few gigs where I'm playing second guitar behind him, which, I did the best I could. It felt, and it was, ironically, it was easier for me to play his D28 than, I'm not sure what, I had a D18 that he might have played, and I played the D28, and I'd stand on stage playing this guitar and think, this is so ridiculous. This is so bogus. How can I, but that didn't last that long. He just, eventually Wyatt joined, so he had a second guitar.
But that first record you did together was Still Inside, wasn't it? It was just the four of you. Yeah,
that's right. And that was the first recording I was ever on, too. So, and I believe that was mostly, we tracked it all live, and I remember overdubbing on one tune, but most of it was just, multiple takes, and then he'd edit the best moments from each take.
And was that recorded at Arch Street?
Yeah, in the basement. I think there was an upstairs room where I think the original Grisman Quintet record was recorded, and the Bluegrass Album Band's recordings were upstairs, but this is just a more small space that you could completely isolate from the other musicians.
And was it, it feels like a clear choice for there to be no banjo on those records, and I'm guessing if you're going for the sort of slightly more expansive, jazzy feel, it takes away some boundaries potentially, because such a strong flavour banjo that suggests certain things.
Nah, I think he just had this, idea of a streamlined band. Yeah, he had the earlier recordings that had the name the Tony Rice Unit were just studio outings where he'd get his friend Sam Bush and Richard Green and Todd, and he was just replicating that. And it was great for me because, Sam Bush was my favorite mandolin player and David Grisman. So I thought, this is great. If I have Sam's playing as a template, that's super exciting to me.
And had you done much of that kind of, the sort of thing that the Grisman Quintet introduced with these extended breaks and long builds and things that maybe people coming from a bluegrass or old-time background aren't used to getting to do?
And not that specifically. Like I said, I'd seen the Grisman Quintet and loved that music and loved the extended solos, but I had played a lot of swing music and slightly more modern. But I was a Jethro Burns fan, and then subsequently, Tiny Moore and Johnny Gimbel. I love that stuff, and Django Reinhardt. Actually, I was sort of introduced to Django Reinhardt from seeing the Great American Music Band because they covered, I think, Swing 42 and Swing 39. And I knew the name, and I knew there was an LP under his and Stefan's name at home that my older brother had possibly. And so I went back and checked that out. Thought, oh, this is great. I like this stuff a lot. And then discovered there was a mandolin player who could play that stuff, equally well. And then Jethro Burns. So I really, tried to play that stuff. So I had a chord vocabulary and somewhat melodic sense of how to improvise on that stuff.
And it is really interesting to sort of look at the timeline around them, because it's easy to think of those three records, kind of Still Inside and Mar West and Backwaters, as being like a period of Tony's evolution, but like through the middle of that, he's recording bluegrass album bands. There's Scout and Rice going on. There's kind of leading in towards Church Street Blues, like at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he invited me to come by the first Bluegrass Album Band session, so I got to meet those guys, listen to a few takes of those tunes, which was great. And I think also Cold on the Shoulder, I was there for some of that as well. So it was a great place to be in. And Tony was always really generous with me. Very, very, he was a good friend.
And it sounds like you did what the Grisman Quintet did, which is a lot of rehearsing before you went out and played live.
Well, part of that is he couldn't line up a fiddle player that he was happy with, so he's just biding his time. And I think Todd Phillips was living out of the area for a period of time too. So maybe in the fall of '80 is when it came together, and then we started rehearsing. But it was different in the sense that, you know, David Grisman's music was, some of it at least, was highly arranged, you know, with the multiple parts and sections. And Tony's pieces were, for the most part, you know, a melody where you state the melody, and then you solo over maybe a different chord progression. Maybe it was just like a vamp session, which you know, was pretty fun to do. It's a little less heady than, you know, trying to wind your way through a bebop melody or something like that, or a jazz standard where you go through different key changes. Although we did record on Green Dolphin Street, which has that kind of that approach.
Yeah, it's got more of a nod towards the kind of Miles Davis kind of blue thing, where you're just sort of given almost a palette to solo over rather than a bunch of changes.
Yeah, yes,
and it really allows for an amount of space in there, doesn't it?
It was pretty free, and I just saw Todd in Nashville when I was there for a music camp, and I was reminding him of every once in a while, you know, on a tune like Gasology, where it was an extended solo section, Tony would stop playing, and Todd and I would just kind of solo together freely, or, you know, have a conversation again like that. So Todd has, you know, big ears and can really respond to what you're doing, and I think, you know, I had some of that going on as well.
And did you play a lot of shows as a band?
I wouldn't say so. We had one national tour, which I think Salt Lake City to Houston to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, to New York to Vermont. I think that was it. And that was great for me because I hadn't traveled that much up to that point. I hadn't been to those. I'd never been to New York, so that was pretty exciting. And then we'd play up and down the West Coast to a certain extent, and in the Bay Area, but not a lot. I just when I was in Nashville, I was teaching at this music camp with Sharon, and Sharon's brother came by. And he mentioned that he had VHS recordings of the final show that version of the band performed at Winfield, which, you know, I'm dying to see what that was like. And that was with Todd, Tony, Wyatt, and myself.
Well, you said, yeah, the Wyatt joined you for Backwaters. And I interviewed Wyatt a couple of years ago, and we talked about the 40th anniversary of Church Street Blues, because he's obviously the only other musician on that record. And and it's nuts how young he was.
I know,
at that point. And he couldn't quite remember the chronology. His feeling was that Church Street Blues was recorded before Backwaters, because he thinks that was his first time in the studio, but he wasn't entirely sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I wasn't really aware of Church Street Blues being recorded at the time, or at least I have no memory of it. So, but I remember Wyatt came out to visit, and you know, stayed at Tony's house, and during the time where I was learning these new tunes, which would ultimately become a part of Still Inside, Wyatt was there, and I'd go over to rehearse with Tony to play those tunes, and I remember Wyatt sort of playing along on those.
And you think about, you know, I think he might have been 17 when they recorded Church Street Blues, and just the confidence and the maturity of his rhythm playing on that record. But then you add on top of that just some of the harmonic stuff and the chord voicings and all of that for Backwaters. And it's just, you know, I mean, it's sort of like Tony had got another Tony in to play behind him.
Yeah, it was kind of uncanny because he wasn't really around Tony that much. I mean, he was a much older brother. And so I guess he picked up enough when he was around him that he just, you know, developed this strong sense of his own playing. And
that record, Backwaters, a few of Tony's records have had the streaming recently, but we went through the sort of process of being remastered and reissued by Craft Recordings, and it's great to have that back out there, and it'd be lovely to have Mar West and Still Inside back out there as well.
That would be great. So you've heard the reissue of Backwaters?
I don't have an original version of it to compare to, so it's hard to know.
Right. Yes, someone just gave me an original copy that I don't have a turntable currently, but I'd love to hear it again.
Yeah, it's a lot of people's favorite. I did a poll recently across various Facebook groups and social channels and things, just to kind of work out what people's favourite Tony Rice records were, because it's such a fascinating conversation. And some people just love that record more than anything.
Backwaters, yeah. Well, I think it was Tony's favorite, or maybe one of his two favorites, which, I'm very proud of that. Yes, interesting. I saw the listings of what. I mean, it kind of makes sense that Manzanita would be rank right up there, which it's my favorite. Yeah,
and it was just interesting to see, because my own favourites change week by week depending on where my head is and how I'm feeling and all of that. But it's just lovely to hear people kind of expressing just how much they love those records,
Yeah.
And so post Backwaters, how did that kind of iteration of the unit come to an end?
Well, I think Tony was a little frustrated because he wanted to do this instrumental ensemble, and people kept clamoring for him to sing, which he was singing, but not when in our performances. And he'd go out and play with the Bluegrass Album Band, a little bit, but it was just not taking off like he had hoped. And I think there were some personal issues going on, and it just kind of had run its course, I guess, in his mind. And he ultimately moved back to the East Coast and started a version of the unit where he had singers, like Jimmy Gaudreau's mandolin player sings tenor, and then Mark Schatz, and Wyatt was still in the band. And that was a great version. I remember seeing them, in the early days and really thinking, oh yeah, this is smart for Tony to do this.
And what happened for you next? What was your sort of next project after that?
I continued on with the Good Old Persons, which, was a really, really good place to be, because there's Kathy Kallick is a wonderful songwriter and prolific, and Paul Shalasky, the fiddle player, he also was a great songwriter and tune writer. He's the guy who wrote Cazadero. And we had a pretty good following, and I just stayed with that. And then living in the Bay Area, there were other musicians I'd just perform with locally. This Paul Saloon was the bluegrass bar in San Francisco, and the different bands would play there. And there was a band that played Western swing that I'd play with on occasion. And actually I also was in a band called Rhythm Future, which was a Django style band. And that was with Beth Weil on bass and Paul Shalasky, who was a great swing fiddler, on guitar and fiddle, and my old friend David Balakrishnan, who I believe still leads the Turtle Island String Quartet. And so we had this Django Reinhardt repertoire. So because of that, I ended up getting gigs playing rhythm guitar with a pretty legit band called I think it was the Royal Society Sextet. And that was great. You had to wear a tuxedo and play rhythm guitar, and that was an interesting thing. And I just do whatever I could, and then I'd have various day jobs that, nothing serious, but just making ends meet. And then ultimately, the Good Old Persons kind of wound down their time together around 92, which kind of coincided with me meeting my wife Gwendolyn, who lived in Vancouver, and I moved to Vancouver in 92, and just I'd still go to the States and tour with various bands, but didn't really start performing under my own name till 99, when I put the Jaybirds together, and a recording called Up in the Woods came out.
And I'd love to talk just briefly, if we get a chance, about Peghead Nation, because that's become a big part of what you do as well. And There's just, the ways we have to transmit this stuff and to get quality teaching rather than relying on whoever happens to live near you. It's sort of changed the game for a lot of people, I think. Yeah,
it's pretty great. And it's gratifying to, travel around and have people say, "Oh yeah, I take your course on Peghead. I really love it." And I'm always recommending, if folks want to know about, learning the mandolin, I say, well, you should check out Sharon Gilchrist's beginning mandolin course. And there's several other, it's pretty mandolin heavy, which is great. But I was, Scott's an old friend. And I guess playing with Scott kind of was part of that time, sort of towards the end of the Good Old Persons. And after Tony, before I moved to Vancouver, and we were in a couple bands together and played on each other's records. But back to Peghead, yeah, it's really good. It's a strange experience teaching a camera, but for the most part, I just I guess I haven't recorded any more of the melodic mandolin courses, which that could pick up again. And the most recent ones I've been doing are old time mandolin, and those are pretty straightforward, so they go pretty quickly.
So it was interesting. I was talking to Mike Marshall, and he teaches on artist works and obviously does various other things as well. And he said he's sort of become aware in recent years that maybe the legacy of that generation, they included the Grissman Quintet and Tony Reischman. He said, people like him and you and Daryl, a big part of that legacy is how this stuff is now handed on, because there's many more opportunities to do that now.
Yes, yeah, it's. I'm happy to be part of that Peghead family, and I think there might be a new mandola course coming up, which I've used the mandola on various recordings and performances in recent years. So. Yeah,
well, very much looking forward to hearing the concerto when the full recording comes out and hearing that new solo album.
Right, I'm looking forward to it as well. And now my big issue is how to sequence it in the overall recording. If that, like at first I thought, I'll just have it be, a 15-minute piece. But then someone pointed out, well, people are going to want to just hear one of these tunes or, at a time rather than be committed to 15 minutes. So I have to sort of figure that out, and then where it will come in the recording and what the next component of this recording will be, because I have, I guess, 7 tunes, so maybe 3 more, which might be a different ensemble still, maybe visiting the more new acoustic stuff, since I've got the old time covered in the concertos there, so.
Yeah, then the whole thing will be instrumental.
Yes, pretty much all I've done as under my own name, or as solo recordings.
Mm. Well, very much looking forward to hearing that. It's been really fun chatting to you about all this, John. Thank you.
Great to talk to you too, Matt. And we'll see you on down the line, maybe in the UK.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.